Hello everyone. We are here with Carrie Christoffersen, the Executive Director of the Loudoun Museum, and Laura Christiansen, the Library Director of Balch Library. We have a slight change of scenery. We're here at the Loudoun Museum within their exhibit Lafayette in Loudoun, and we're going to talk about a very special part of their exhibit and the fun research journey Laura went down with this wonderful item. So I'll just pass it off to Carrie to give a little introduction about that item.
Great, thanks for coming to be with us at the museum today. One of the artifacts we have on exhibit as part of this show is a newspaper titled Leesburg Spectator, and it dates to August 16th of 1825, and the newspaper itself gives a full and vast account of the Marquis de Lafayette's visit to Leesburg in 1825, about a week earlier, prior to the actual publication date. Newspapers of this era did a healthy amount of borrowing from each other, so the account we find in this newspaper is virtually identical to the account we find in the Genius of Liberty, which is virtually identical to the account we find in the Richmond Enquirer. The Richmond paper dates to later, so we know that they copied from either the Spectator or the Genius of Liberty. But we are delighted to have it because it outlines exactly what happened on that day. And in the exhibit here, we talk about Lafayette's life, a little bit of his importance to the American Revolution, his lasting legacy, and in particular, we take a deep dive into his visit to Loudoun County and to Leesburg in 1825 when we rolled out that red carpet for him.
Great. And so Laura here took a special interest in this newspaper, and do you want to talk about what you found intriguing about this piece?
Yeah, so when we were getting ready for the Lafayette celebrations and talking in committees and with Carrie about our mutual exhibit planning, she mentioned the Leesburg Spectator, and I was like, the Leesburg Spectator? Because I'm familiar with the Genius of Liberty. So I have here Genius of Liberty, and we can put in an image of the paper, which you can look and compare with the Spectator and see that they are extremely similar looking as 19th century newspapers generally are at this point. But I was like, I've never heard of the Leesburg Spectator, and I was incredibly jealous because we don't have it. So, I was curious, what's the story with this paper? So I started to do a little digging, and I put on my librarian hat. So first I went to the Directory of U.S. Newspapers and American Libraries, which is a resource that the Library of Congress put together basically in the 90s as part of the U.S. Newspaper Project. It's a great place to go and just get the details of a newspaper, because it'll tell you what preceded it and what followed it, and that kind of tells you the lineage of the paper. Sometimes it'll tell you the editor or the dates it ran for, that sort of thing. So I went, and it does have the Leesburg Spectator in it. The other thing that's great is it tells you at the time this record was created, how many libraries held copies. And what I found is that in addition to Carrie's copy here at the museum, there are 3 other copies of this newspaper that exist. And not just of this issue. So the Library of Virginia and the University of Virginia each have copies. The Library of Virginia has the earlier copy, one that dates to July 12th of 1825. So this paper, it seems like, ran for an unspecified, very small amount of time in 1825. So that got me even more curious, because I'm like, what is going on with this paper? So I noticed that the publisher and editor is named Robert McIntyre. And I was like, who's Robert McIntyre? Absolutely. So I went to another wonderful resource, the Library of Virginia's Index of Virginia Printing, which was produced by David Ralston, who was a researcher in the past and climbed through all of these records of newspapers throughout Virginia and sort of compiled information about their publishers and editors. And it did not have the Spectator at all. It did mention, it does not have Robert McIntyre as a printer. And so that got me even more curious. It does have Patrick McIntyre. And Patrick McIntyre and his son, C.C. McIntyre, because in the 19th century, so many people only have initials and not names. He does. But Patrick McIntyre is better known as the publisher and editor of the Washingtonian, which is another paper that I am familiar with and that we have copies of. And the Washingtonian sort of existed early throughout the 19th century and actually continues till like basically the Civil War. So I was like, what? This is really interesting. Who's this McIntyre who's broken off from his father? So I was like, maybe this is a relative. So David Ralston, in his Index of Printing, gave me the hard news to swallow that, in fact, Patrick McIntyre died in July of 1821. So, you know, who is Robert McIntyre? Did he take over from his father? But David also says that when he died, he willed the business to his minor son, Christopher, who of course is C.C. McIntyre. And I was like, well, who is Robert? And in David's account, he sort of implies that Patrick and his wife Mary only had this one child. So I was like, I don't know, this doesn't seem right. So maybe he's a brother or something. So I go to the Genius of Liberty and find Patrick McIntyre's obituary. And in the Genius of Liberty, the editor then, whose name was B.W. Sauer, mentioned that the newspaper, the Washingtonian, will be continued to be published by the eldest son, C.C. McIntyre, but that Patrick had left a large family, and his widow. And I did some more research, and finding in his will, I discovered that there were in fact 8 children that Patrick McIntyre left behind, and they were all minors in the eyes of the court. So you had, in addition to C.C., Robert, Catherine, Lucy, Laura, Ellen, which happen to be my 2 names, John Alexander, and Mary. And they were all appointed a guardian, who happens to also be connected to the library, L.P.W. Balch, who was Thomas Balch's father. And so I'm like, okay, well, we know Robert was the next eldest son of Patrick. So I dig further into the Genius of Liberty, and I find out that the Washingtonian continued to publish from 1821 basically until 1825 without interruption, and it continues to do something else that I think Carrie's probably familiar with, that 19th century newspapers are really fond of, and that's fight.
Yeah.
So the Washingtonian and the Genius of Liberty got into little squabbles all of the time, including disagreeing about whether words each other used were actual words. They were involved in all sorts of political discussions and disagreements. At one point, there's a poem published by B.W. Sauer that seems to be making fun of the McIntyres for being quite fancy in terms of dress. It's really,
not after me.
It's very entertaining. I would read it if we had more time. But basically, the paper continues until the very beginning of August in 1825, when the Genius of Liberty runs a little notice saying, where they had an article where they replied to something that the Leesburg Spectator had said that they said was wrong, and explained how they were in fact right. But in a little asterisk note, they say, by the way, in case you missed it, there's now this paper called the Leesburg Spectator that started, it says on the 2nd Ultimo, which implies that it was around on July 2nd. Mm-hmm. And all of these papers published on Tuesdays, once a week. So there should be more issues of this paper floating around out there. And it explains that the paper replaces the Washingtonian, which is defunct, but it is still being published by the same publishers, implying that the McIntyres are still involved. But it also says that there's a change in editorial staff, which I think is implying that there's a switch between Charles, C.C., and Robert. And Robert is now the editor.
Nice.
Which is quite impressive, because Robert's birth date was in 1811, which makes him 14 years old when he takes over as editor of this paper. Now, I think we can agree that probably 1825-14 might be a little different than 2025-14, but this is quite impressive. And he continues to publish the paper for some time and to be involved. It's unclear how far into 1825 the Spectator continues, or if it even goes into 1826. Nobody seems sure. They all have very unclear end dates. But I think it may have only existed for that year. At some point, the Washingtonian reemerges with C.C. as the editor, and he does continue to publish it until 1861, quite ably. Now, Robert, what happens to him? I was very curious. So I tried to find records, and I did eventually find some records that showed that he became a lawyer later in life. But I also found a lot of records that showed that he may have been drawn to the law through experience with the courts. So he appears in court summons several times between 1826 and 1829 for getting into altercations and accosting people. Including one of Anna's relatives.
Oh yes, yes. Poor Ree Polton got in the way.
Yeah. So he's pulled into court, and then in 1829, the very last time he shows up in the summons, he's being sued for libel by B.W. Sowers, the competing newspaper editor. And throughout these records, he's described as a printer. So we know he's still working in the printing business during this time. After 1829, though, he is not. I can't find any other records that say that. So it seems that maybe at 19, he finally was like, well, I'm going to do something else. He does become a lawyer, and he continues to live in Leesburg with two of his sisters until after the 1860 census, when I can't find a record of him after that. But very interesting. A couple things that I noticed in the Spectator that kind of are of interest. As Carrie mentioned, the account is very similar, almost exactly similar, of the visit of Lafayette. And I think, Anna, you can actually, because this is really cool, flip it.
Because the details are on the
and
inside.
take a look at the actual account. And so I have a question. These papers did not get along, at least most of the time in print. So now, did they collaborate on this account? Did one wholeheartedly steal from the other? I feel like if one had taken from the other, the alternate number would have complained, which we don't have the following issue from the Spectator, so that could still be the case.
Right.
I also wonder if a third party wrote it and supplied it to both.
Any of those things, honestly, are possible. I know that there was some outright stealing, we might say, but party borrowing was pretty common during this era of the print news industry. So it may have just been, as long as you stuck to what we said, we're not gonna fuss at you too hard. If you stray or start to get into details that we don't deem accurate, then we might fuss at each other. But there's no clarity at all between these two different newspapers, who might have come to it first, or whether there was indeed a third party who simply supplied it to both of them.
You know, it is a very detailed account, so it may have been that beforehand they agreed you're going to be the person who records what happens.
Right.
And they did a great job, I think. I mean, we don't know, we weren't there.
Right. I mean, there are some things that we have found out since then that, at least in this account, it closes with the notion that as soon as the evening's dinner was done, that the Lafayette and his entourage, went sort of immediately and overnighted at Belmont, when in fact we now know that they took a side quest and went off to Temple Hall first.
The other thing that is interesting, so after I kind of gained all this information, I did go back to the paper and I snuck over here and looked. And there are a couple clues to this sort of change in leadership at the newspaper. For instance, if you look at the ads in this paper, there are the normal ads that you see both in the Washingtonian and the Genius of Liberty. So you have legal notices, things like that. You have self-emancipated people as enslaved ads. You have
So a lot of ads that point to people that Robert McIntyre would have known. So I think on the back panel, Anna, there's actually an ad that says caution. I don't know where you are.
Yeah.
There. It says caution. It's in the far panel. If you notice, that is placed by Robert's mother, Mary. And it's warning about land. I think there's actually maybe more than one from her. There's also a legal notice placed by LPW Balch. And sort of circling back to that poem that B.W. Sowers published, implying that maybe the McIntyres were fashionable lads. There's a lot of ads for tailors.
Interesting.
So I like to think that maybe he is starting this venture and he's pulling on his community to help fund it. But definitely publishing an issue of this paper in August 1825 would have been a great opportunity to sell a lot of papers.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, one of the biggest events to happen in Leesburg was going on.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that is a fascinating little network and a little interesting side note to our newspaper history here in Loudoun. So thank you for that little journey. And Carrie, could you remind us of how long this exhibit is up here at the museum?
Sure. The Lafayette and Loudoun exhibit will be on display at the museum through the end of the year. You know, we're not going to close it on the 31st either, but you get the idea. You can see it all year long here. And as the time goes by, we'll have little new things coming in and on and off exhibit, so keep your eyes peeled.
Awesome. Thank you both so much.